Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. Hello, everyone. This is Mike Forsberg, and this is another episode of Whooping Crane Chronicles. Today, I am with Andy Caven, the International Crane Foundation, and with Dylan Jones of Dylan Jones Conquers the World. Today, we're doing something a little bit different and recording this episode on Zoom. Andy is joining us from his home in Tennessee, and Dylan is joining us from his home near Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories, Canada. Andy, Dylan, and I spent 8 days in a blind in the Canadian wilderness documenting whooping cranes at the nest a few summers ago. Well, 2 summers ago. Man, it seems like forever ago and yesterday, which is what we're going to cover in today's episode. So first, I just want to welcome you, Dylan and Andy. Thanks for making the time, you guys. Appreciate it very much.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, good to see you. I think we'll do introductions first. Dylan, we'll start with you. Dylan, the first time I met you, we were on snowmobiles. I don't know if you remember that or not, but that was back in April of 2022. And we were with Greg Robinson, who worked at the park at the time, and you worked at the park at the time. And then Jeff Dale, who is a good friend of mine that had made a number of time-lapse cameras that we were stringing up and down the entire whooping crane flyway from Texas to Wood Buffalo. And Wood Buffalo was the last 2 locations we were going to put cameras. So, it was, do you remember that day?
I do. Yeah.
Tell folks a little bit about where you're from.
Dylan Jones, French Métis, originally from Fort Good Hope, Northwest Territories, about 16 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. That's where I was born and raised, in a small little community, 450 people. It's 99% Aboriginal community, very much still subsistence, still hunting for the majority of meat products and stuff along those lines. Still very much part of the land and living with that. Moved down to Fort Smith to attend school and sort of check out what you guys do down here, and ended up staying, working for parks, various other groups around the area, and then quit it all. I couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand the desk stuff. So then I've moved on to opening my own company. We have hazard tree removals, extreme condition mine site reclamation, and after fire emergency response. So, and I've gotten a few pieces of heavy equipment, so we actively fight fire with those, and built a sawmill. I have a logging crew now. It's full-time too, which is odd. Trying to be the first construction lumber producer ever out of the Northwest Territories.
Before we started the podcast, you were holding a little one in your arms.
Yeah.
Tell us about your family a little bit.
Yeah, been married almost 14 years now, I guess, come February, to my wife, Inuit, from Iqaluit. I have 2 sons and 3 daughters, all various ages, oldest being 14, youngest being 1 month. So, yeah.
You know, we'll get back to this later, but it just strikes me that on one of our last days out in the bush last year with the whooping cranes, one of the chicks hatched on the same day that was your daughter's birthday.
Yeah, my oldest daughter, Paisley.
Yeah. Things happen.
Mm.
All right, let's go on over to Dr. Andrew Caven.
My name's Andy. As Mike said, I don't have a doctorate. Actually, I have 2 master's degrees, which is pretty nerdy. But I work with the International Crane Foundation in a leadership role. But I dream of still being an ecologist, and I try and fit it in when I can. My title is Vice President of North America Programs, which is a mouthful, and I never use it. Been working in ecology for a long time, but in the crane world, the last decade and change. I came to the crane world through the Crane Trust, where I was lead biologist and then director of research there. And what got me into cranes was my former experience in long-term research and kind of like monitoring ecological systems, grasslands and wetlands through time. I worked in desert grasslands and in wetlands. Wetlands in the desert are still probably one of my favorite things, walk for 4 or 5 miles and then get to a spring that looks like Fern Gully, like an oasis. It still, inspires me, but, it's all connected. And I live in Tennessee with my partner, who's also an ecologist, who used to work with Mike, named Emma Brindley Buckley, who's a hydrologist for the National Park Service. So Parks North America there too, Parks Canada, and I'm an ex-Parky. I worked for the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Network in the Chihuahua Desert as well. So we have a lot of park connects here. And I don't have any kids. I just have lots of animals. I've got my 2 dogs and cats making noise. So my cat's trying to knock over boxes in this room right now, of course. So, that's a little about me. I love adventuring and seeing the edge of things. And so being out there with you 2 was really fun. I know you're both the same way, kind of getting to what would have been the edge of my perception in terms of, being on that boreal wilderness edge and being dropped in. It was pretty neat.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. I remember roughly the first time I met you on the Platte. Man, it became very apparent very quickly that you were a person that lives to learn, and you have a ridiculous memory. And you also are, I think it was the first night I was out at the Crane Trust on the Platte, and you got your banjo out and started playing. So you're also a musician, and Dylan is also a hip hop artist. So we've got a very talented crew, and I can barely blow a note into a harmonica and make it sound decent. So we'll maybe, let's. A lot of times when we talk to biologists, scientists, and other folks that have worked at some point in time, at least in that world, people get an idea that folks that are working in the science world are fairly stuffy, and that's all that they do. Andy, talk a little bit about what you do when you're not working and when you're not plugged into writing papers and all that other sort of stuff.
Well, you're human. If you're a scientist, you still get to be human. And I think, science is just one of these things where you keep track of things, you count it, you tabulate it, you kind of put your life into bar graphs and such things. And, that way of thinking doesn't necessarily leave you even in your normal day-to-day life. So I tend to track more things than I'd like in terms of, how many steps did I do today? And, other things. But, I just like being outside. I like to learn about everything I find outdoors, kind of always getting in trouble that way. So is my old dog, Bruno, who's 14, who recently got bit in the face by a copperhead, but he lived to tell the tale. But I've been stung by about everything, including North America's most painful sting in the tarantula hawk, 2 of them right in the back. But it's never dissuaded me because I just love seeing how it all works, And that's a little bit about myself, and then, for fun, sports, music. Right now I'm a little bit hobbled. I hurt my knee and trying to avoid surgery. I've been doing PT for about 5 months, but that just drives me bonkers because I like to be on the move, Yeah. But yeah, nature's been nature exploration, adventure, moving around, music, active things. It's kind of what I like.
What were you like as a kid, Andy?
Well, there's photo documentation of me in a Speedo catching my own fish in a
Yikes.
in a minnow net, and then fishing with my own I'd catch all these little minnows and go, bass and walleye fishing and stuff. So it's pretty much floating around in the water in South Dakota and Minnesota until I started working at 14. So those kid summers were just swimming around fishing.
Yeah.
That's what I was like.
Yeah. Dylan, what was it like for you as a kid?
We lived a pretty bush life. Little big family, tiny house way up north. We had everything we needed. But we spent a lot of time in the bush, cutting trees and hunting, and a lot of time on the land. That was months at a time. My dad was he was a guide for a long time. He pretty much figured out how to get everything he didn't have in town out of the bush, and showed us how to do this more or less the same thing. A lot of being cold and not crying. A lot of stuff like that. Yeah. Just kind of like Andy there, lots of fishing and lots of hunting and stuff, but not so much of a casual fun time. with all our journeys out, a lot of it was mixed with severity, I guess. We needed the things we were going for. There was no real going back, I guess. A lot of sports in the little communities are huge. It's thanks to our government system here, they kind of there's a lot of stuff to be said about it, but when you're from a little community and there's a certain amount of lack of stuff, the government kind of steps in here and gave us hockey equipment and things and different sports stuff, and would pay our ways to different tournaments and stuff. So everybody got pretty intense about sports, pretty much just playing sports and going in the woods, I guess. But again, it wasn't going in the woods to us. That was just where we lived.
Right. It's very, very different perspective, different culture, different. Yeah,
we had certain places to go, certain times of year for different animals, different places you had to be at. Mm-hmm. The seasons change and whatnot, and community hunts.
There was something that struck me when we were dropped off by helicopter to do our vigil with the birds. When the helicopter flew away, you turned to Andy and I and you said, "Well, boys, you're in the wilderness now."
Yeah.
And you didn't say we are in the wilderness now. You said you are in the wilderness now. And that always stuck with me. And I didn't take it as a slight. What I took it as is that your upbringing and your culture, the way that you live in the world is very different than the way that we do.
I think it interact a little differently,
yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about whooping cranes a little bit. Andy, do you remember the first time you saw a whooping crane?
That's a good question. I actually don't know if I can separate out all the. Well, yes, I do actually. All the times on the Platte. My first one was actually in graduate school in Georgia, and I hadn't been thinking about it, but I was actually in Bob Cooper's ornithology class, who is a now retired, pretty esteemed professor at the University of Georgia. And there was a report of one of these EMP whooping cranes, Eastern Migratory Population, the reintroduced whooping cranes, in a suburb in South Georgia. And it's a whole van of, ornithology students, some grad students, some undergrads. I was a grad student. A lot of people thought I was a TA, but I was just a grad student in the class. And, we're tooling around and just going, driving like a bat out of hell, the TA is, to get to this whooping crane before it takes off. And then, of course, there's two whooping cranes with all their jewelry and about the smallest little alfalfa field. It's probably 25 acres on the edge of this suburb in South Georgia, Southwest Georgia. And that was the first whooping crane I saw. And I was like, holy cow. I mean, that's a bird.
So that was about what time, what year?
That was about 15 years ago-ish. Yeah.
Okay. So that was part of the Eastern Migratory Flyway, that experimental population, right? That started in 2001.
Yeah.
Led by costumed pilots in ultralight aircraft to teach a new migration route to a new group of birds that were raised with the intention of trying to get a new population migrating on the landscape, correct?
Yeah, it was exactly. It was 15, 16 years ago, and they were just kind of pulling the trigger on moving away from the assisted migration, and the birds were kind of starting to go everywhere, right? Operation Migration was the first 10 years of it, I think, through like 2012. they're kind of starting to back away from it. And this was right before that. But I think the birds were starting to, it was getting harder to corral them and whatever, and they started to really do their own thing once they moved away from those ultralights,
So in a nutshell, for our listeners, we have an established self-sustaining last wild migratory population, which are the birds that nest in Wood Buffalo National Park and migrate through the heart of the Great Plains to the Texas Gulf Coast, mostly in and around Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. And then there's been efforts because of the rarity of these birds and to make sure that they don't blink out, is to try to reestablish other populations of whooping cranes in other places. Right. So the eastern migratory population is an experiment that started in the early 2000s, 2001, I believe, is continuing on today. And then there is another population, a non-migratory population that existed historically in the Louisiana marshes and some other places, perhaps, down there, that blinked out in around 1950. And they, in 2011, started to reintroduce that non-migratory population there, too. And that continues going on today. So you saw those birds 15, 16 years ago in the experimental population. Then you ended up on the Platte River working for the Crane Trust for a while. Do you remember the first time that you saw one of these birds in the Wood Buffalo to Aransas flock on the Platte River?
Yeah, it was a totally different feeling. That's what I was trying to separate. I have a few first memories, but, one of the early memories, I think it was February 28th, and it was one of the earlier whooping cranes to arrive. And there's big flocks of sandhills, and like descending through them, just this single, whooping crane dropping out of the sky. And it was a grind jumping in, and it's a great organization, the Crane Trust, but they'd been going through some growing pains, and the science department and leadership had changed over, and it was a hard week. I remember kind of like, oh my God, what am I doing here? I just moved up from New Mexico. I took this job on a whim, took a pay cut to take the job because it sounded so cool. It was closer to my family. Then that whooping crane started descending out of the sky. I was like, that's why I'm here. And that's what I remember saying to myself. Like us, they have cultures, right? And information that's passed on across generations about how to live on the landscape and navigate threats and acquire food, right? And I've watched whooping cranes on the Platte, as you have, Mike, right? Like injure a fish so the colt can then eat it, right? They didn't kill the fish and give it to the colt. They injured it so the colt could kind of deal with a floppy fish. And you and I have both seen that. And, it's the reintroductions. There's been two that we've tried and failed in Florida, and also in breeding in Idaho, Grace Lake, and we're on to two more, and hopefully they're doing better. But there's this ancient knowledge in that Aransas Wood Buffalo flock about how to navigate the landscape, where to eat, what to eat, where to drink, all that stuff, what to avoid. It's a parallel lesson for us as humans too, as we talk about being in the bush, right? That survival. How good are your skills? How much have they been passed from generation to generation? Luckily, Dylan didn't let you and I die out there.
You guys had enough equipment.
Yeah,
we had enough equipment.
I went back and looked at some of our notes, and I think our helicopter weight, which included our weights, was like 1,071 pounds. Something like that.
Food, though. A lot of food and water, though.
There was a lot of food and water. So, Dylan, I want to ask you about cranes too. My first time up in Fort Smith was in 2022 when I just my buddy Chris Boyer had traveled up in a small plane from Texas to Wood Buffalo, and I thought when we got there, when I started meeting people in the local community, that everybody would be really excited about whooping cranes. Yeah, right. That's exactly the response I got. I thought, what the heck, man? So tell us. We always separate between you up there and us down here, but I think it's more than that. Talk to us about cranes, Dylan, and from a cultural perspective, if you will, but from a personal perspective too. And I would like to know when the first time was that you saw a whooping crane.
Okay, so the first time I ever heard about them was the one that you can't eat.
Yep.
And then but they're not from, they don't go where I'm from. It's not a thing anybody speaks about. I was introduced to them when I came down here, but I guess my opinion on animals you can't eat is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things I guess is best left alone. There's a lot of spiritual ties to them from the people down here. That's they represent different things, but I don't want to speak on their behalf. And where I'm from, we don't have them. To me, it's like many things you find in the woods that are meant to be there and serve an important purpose that's separated from us. Perhaps not something I would normally track or meddle with, to be honest with you. Very magical species, very much angelic-like, very much something different than us, and suits a world that I don't think we understand quite as well as we'd hope. Yeah, like I said, most times I've been taught to sort of leave well enough alone when it comes to these types of animals, unless there's something you can convince yourself is important and maybe helpful, and such as I thought of this trip with you guys, that maybe it's helpful to know more and, learn before it's too late. And it seemed important, and it seemed what you guys are doing was the right thing, and happy, and you love them, and it shows even when you talk. So my first introduction, I suppose, to the bird was through college, and their affinity with it. Sort of the more government offices seem to really love them. It's a big attraction. It's very rare, very important. Small towns don't have a whole bunch to draw people from other places here, so I understand the attraction from the government standpoint, but from the people's disinterest that you might have noticed, I'm not sure it's disinterest or more so that it's just something we don't touch. Generally, you don't just leave them well enough alone. They continue on their seemingly magical existence, and we don't really understand where they go or why. Just that when they're here, they're safe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, Dylan.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't know, if there was two other people, I probably never would have went. But for some reason, as you know, I don't often do too many things just because someone thinks it's the right idea. Yeah. This is very interesting. So my first real experience with whooping cranes, where I actually sat and watched and appreciated them, was with you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember you and I went out first, and we had somebody with us. I can't remember her name right now. That's it. Yeah. And we went out to the Salt Plains, and we had seen a nesting pair on helicopter surveys, which happen twice a year up in Wood Buffalo National Park. And the nesting surveys that are conducted in May, and then there's some chick surveys that are done later in the year. But after the nesting surveys were done in May, there was a pair that were nesting in the Salt Plains, which was one of the locations within Wood Buffalo National Park. For people that don't know, it's the largest national park by area in Canada, and one of the largest declared national parks in the world. There's very few roads, so it's a vast wilderness. But the Salt Plains is one area that people that are visiting the park can see whooping crane territory from a distance. So we were able to go in with permission to look at those birds from an escarpment, looking down the hill into this very ancient beaver pond, and watch these two sit out in the middle of their well, it's just one. We couldn't see the other bird the whole time we were there. But I was looking at the videos, Dylan, last night of us when we saw that bird for the first time, and the excitement in your voice was obvious. And for me, there's no greater gift than to see somebody else light up with a new discovery. I think what you had said at the time is that you might have seen them before, but they stood out very differently than swans, right?
Yeah, I've seen them down a place called the Bocane River.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a eutrophied river here that used to be a place people would go into Bocane Lake chasing down whitefish, and
right.
Lake whitefish. And then over years and years, these beavers made a series of dams, and now it's completely eutrophied, and you can barely weasel your way up there with a canoe, and that's where they were.
Mm-hmm.
Two of them, and we were going to go up onto them because I thought they were swans. We were going to shoot them.
Right.
But it's just one of the things we eat, but it wasn't we ended up coming across these like just wispy ghost like super tall things that once they stood up, it was like, holy God, are we up here with? And they were just jet white. Like it just seemed so different, so out of place. And then I was never sure if that's exactly what it was until that day when we looked out over that escarpment and seen them there, and it kind of clicked. Yeah. It was we were almost a little afraid of them almost. It's kind of weird to say, but there was sort of that was where we even turned back. Mm-hmm. For some reason, it seemed wrong to go further, because none of us really knew what to do around them.
Yeah.
So we kind of just left well enough alone and went back, shot a few ducks and went back. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember that day with you, not just for seeing the whooping cranes, but you took us to a place where there were beaver. Oh, yeah. It was like an entire beaver civilization, or yeah. What'd you call it? Lumberyard?
No, Beaver's Lumberyard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Their little workshop and everything there. Eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that poking around, and then you took me to the edge of the Slave River, and we saw wolf tracks along the bank, which I know is not uncommon for you, very uncommon for me, but uncommon for you there, in what was a very powerful place, a sad place in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about that location a little bit?
Down by Bell? Old Bell?
Yeah.
Where they pull up the ships, the uranium?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where they got local people here, tricked into carrying bags of uranium ore up in burlap sacks from one ship to transfer onto another holding. And there's just a lot of terrible stories surrounding that place of how the people here and their the way they have now they're non-wasteful, so they try to make use of everything. And just like the bags, right, when the burlap sacks were emptied of their ore and still laden with, I guess, uranium, instead of throwing them out, of course, they were turned into curtains, blankets, crib liners, things of those sorts, because there's all this free material. Why waste it? It's warm, it's good, can be cleaned. Little did they know that hereditary cancers and whatnot and stuff would flow on, and that area would eventually be closed down by the government and given back by the church at another point, and now left in a state where you can't dig more than 6 inches, but with no perimeter limits or nothing like that. So it is an interesting area. If you stand in the right spot, you can see where they once pulled up these big boats and everything, and where all the fur went down the river and so on and so forth. It is a strange spot for sure down there. Yeah. What once was a thriving place to meet became a transfer station, and then became a cause for alarm, I suppose. A place to go and get sick. Yeah. And find wolf tracks.
Yeah.
To break a somber mood there.
No, I mean, as a photographer that spends long lengths of time in places, you go in with an idea of what a place is, what the experience is going to be like, and then you let it wash over you. If you're open to meeting the people and hearing the stories, you learn an awful lot more, and all of a sudden a place is something that you look at across space and time, not within the walls of particular borders or boundaries, not in the outline of a park or a territory or anything, but try to think and try to feel and learn and hear the voices that are there that are speaking. The experience with you that first day, that first real day with you, was really powerful for me, and it sort of set my my frame. And at that point, I had just come back from a week's worth of flying with the park and the Canadian Wildlife Service to identify nest sites where biologists were putting remote cameras and acoustic recorders near several nest sites to help try to understand more of the hidden lives of these birds and how they live their lives at the nest. So part of my role then was to photograph the researchers doing what they do and doing that work. But another element was to try to identify a location that Andy and I could try to observe from blinds, photograph film and then document for science these birds at the nest with the hopeful hatching of a chick. And we ended up finding that location in the Gnarling watershed. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I probably didn't, but did I, Dylan?
Yeah, Gnarling.
Okay, Gnarling. And I think we visited 35 or 40 sites, or at least looked at them. And out of that, 20 of them were ones that got equipment put near the nests. And only one of those was a real workable situation for the possibility of a blind. Then we started deciding how we were going to do what we were going to do. Andy, I first tried to do this in 2022. And I stopped before we even got started because 2022 was a high water year, very cold year, and I was told that it wasn't possible to do it. So 2023, we started talking about doing this together. And I'd like to hear from you, like what motivated you to come on board and see this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the truth is there's only been a few groups of folks, to spend time up there doing that sort of behavioral research. And there just wasn't a lot of information on parental care and provisioning. And most of what we knew is from captive birds or reintroduced birds. And it was the chance of a lifetime. And also like to really understand that landscape, and to be immersed in it. I mean, I think that was a driver. Something came up earlier when we're talking about, Dylan was saying, well, these birds, leave well enough alone, these kind of private birds, but you two seem okay. The truth is, right, they were at their peak at the last ice age, right? And they inhabit, there's from what we know, many thousands of them, likely more than 10,000 at the end of the last ice age, and a few times more of that at the peak of the ice age. I mean, this is this ice age bird, and there's these remnant spots, just not spoiled enough where they still bred, and where we didn't even find them till the mid 1950s. And I mean, could you really understand this bird without plopping down and watching them there? And I've always been experiential like that, right? Like, you can take somebody's word for it, or you could put up some passive monitoring equipment, but to sit there and watch it and see how it lives and what it's doing to navigate the landscape, that's another, you're always going to learn more than you think you're going to learn. So that was my motivation, and I knew I could come up with some cash, and I knew you needed cash. And I was like, well, this might be my way in. I kind of wondered. I was like, Mike's probably like, God bless America. That Andy, he's just jumping on this and he's coming with. But I figured at the end you'd be excited too, because you knew you had one more person to handle the situation, right? Like to tell the story. I mean, we had to have an incubator in our permitting, right? If we were to scare the birds off and they abandoned the nest, we had to have an incubator so we could save the eggs and get them back to the Calgary Zoo. And facing that alone is kind of daunting, So in the end, I hoped that at least I was a respite in that regard. And if I was there by myself, like not having you to bounce things off of, right, it would have been a lot, because it wasn't scary being out in the wilderness. That's something like we all love on this call, 8 days in the blind and 9 days out there. Yeah, we went to the bathroom in our blinds in a bucket. No big deal, right? But
that's the only thing people want to know anyway.
That's all they want to know, right?
Yeah.
But for us, the scary part was the crane, right? Like we don't want to impact these birds into full circle my story. We don't want to impact these birds in their ancient ice age kingdom, right? We don't want to have a negative impact. This is a rare opportunity to get helicoptered in, dropped. We don't want to screw that up.
Yeah.
And so in the end, I was really glad I could be there and be there with you. But there was part of me that was like, I kind of forced my way.
No, I don't think you forced your way in at all, Andy. I was, I'm just a loner and I'm used to doing stuff alone, and, but I knew you and we're solid friends well before that. And so it wasn't a big jump for me. Dylan, on your end, so you agreed to do this. What were your responsibilities that you were charged with from the point that you knew you were going to do this to the time that we got into the helicopter? And then we'll jump to actually being on the ground and what that was like.
It wasn't. It wasn't too bad. It was just like setting up for a multi-day hunting trip, and you guys obviously knew what you were doing from places you'd been before. The only thing new seemed to be the environment you're stepping into. But you guys were well prepared on your own. Maybe a little too much stuff, but I'm sure you learned after that trip and many others. I'm sure you've taken in that time that, you know, you get through your stuff. You don't know if it's worth taking until you've tested it or carried it too far that you don't want to again. Just trying to figure out how we were going to pack our food, you know, what kind of water we would need. Trying to wonder if, you know, how we would all fare out there, how everybody would hold up, knowing you guys had to be locked in essentially a solitary confinement, but with something of a continuous interest in front of you makes it a little simpler. You weren't staring at a wall. So I figured, you know, as long as you're passionate about it, it should be the whole purpose, right in front of you.
Yeah.
So I thought it would be good. Everybody seemed mentally there. And the only troublesome is that you kind of touched on there, Andy, is some people don't like to be out in the bushes alone once that sun goes down and things start chirping and noises start mixing and et cetera, et cetera. But you guys had it.
So we were dropped off on June 2nd, right around, I think it's maybe around noon. You know, it wasn't far off of that. And what we needed to do first was, you know, establish the landing pad and then go in with our blinds and set those up. Dylan zip us in basically, and then Dylan was going to be based at a base camp near the helicopter drop site as long as we were going to remain in our blinds. So yeah, Andy and I were zipped in for those 8 days, and the blinds were 4 foot wide by 4 foot high by 7 feet long, and we were side by side, cozy side by side. In fact, I was listening to Merlin every morning when the morning chorus of birds would start singing, which was at about 3 a.m. up there. The very first recording of the day, first day we were there, Andy, I heard, you know, white-crowned sparrows and swamp sparrows and bitterns and all this other sort of stuff, and then I heard you snoring. so that's how close we were. So it was, you know, we literally shared a tent wall. We could have touched our hands. But Dylan was back at the base camp. So I'll let you pick it up from there, Dylan, to tell folks what that was like and what you were doing there. I also, since you mentioned it,
Nice.
see what I got here? I've got the spoon that Dylan carved. Carved one for you too, Andy. I also have this. You remember this, Dylan?
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Carved a crane into the. Not sure what wood this is.
It's a black spruce.
Yeah, and really beautiful profile of a crane. So you had a lot of time.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. No, it was good. I didn't mind going in to see you guys was the objective. Like, it wasn't, oh my gosh, I got to do this again. It just, it wasn't the first time guiding it. You know, I've spent much longer in the bushes. I've been alone quite a few times with no other people to go see. So then it wasn't bad. And then going to see you guys added structure. So just like anything, you plan your little points. You know, you have to be okay with being quiet. You don't say a word or anything, right? You're always listening, and just try to identify all the sounds around you on the first night or during the day, so then you can just be comfortable and you know where it is again around this time. And the worry was that you guys, you know, weren't getting too hot. As you remember, it was very, very lots of chances of heat stroke, and I guess I was by myself for the majority of it, but there was lots of places to walk and look around, and we were alone. There wasn't any other people, but there sure was a lot of life, other things to watch. The big clouds of dragonflies every evening, the different birds that you guys knew every one just by sound. Trying to find predator tracks every day, expanding my circle, trying to change our trails, crawl through as little swamp as possible. That part kind of sucked.
Yeah.
Sucked. There was a lot of bugs, and then, once you got close to where you guys were, it was all swamp for like the big runs. It's like, sweet. Not only am I crawling in this swamp, I know for a fact Andy P's where I have to get up here. I know it.
Actually, that's not true. Actually, when I peed out kind of the side opposite Forsberg. I didn't pee out the back. I only cooked out the back. So you never went through my pee.
These guys have got to be rolling this downhill, and I'm downhill here.
I aimed it. I did. I had a little hole in the corner front of my tent, so like it didn't go at the whooping crane, but it didn't go toward the back. And I pretty much, not saying some didn't percolate down, but you did not ever have to crawl directly in my pee stream. So you know.
I wondered if I would do that, but I thought I was anyway.
And you still did it because you're a great man. But, so I did. That was my question, was like, were you as excited to see us as we were to see you? And I can't even remember the periodicity of it, right? Like, it was like, there was a couple of days where we didn't go every day. It was pretty much most days at like late morning ish, but maybe into early noon. But then there was like maybe 1 or 2 days where we like skipped a whole day, if I recall.
We had set up a protocol to call in later morning once we figured out the rhythm of the birds, where they would be on their nest early in the day, and then it's usually mom on the nest overnight. Dad would come in, and when Dad would come in, he was molting, going through a complete molt, so he was flightless. When Mom would fly off, we would time that, and we had communication, Dylan and I and Andy, through walkie-talkies, and we would coordinate that daytime meet. So say, okay, I think we're ready, and Dylan would come in, and then you'd get about 100 yards away or so, and there was a place where you were completely hidden still, and then we would wait to make sure that there wasn't going to be an issue at the nest, and then you'd come in. So
then the crawling started.
Yeah. And so water was the big thing, right? Because when we first dropped those blinds in place, we were thinking maybe we would draw water from right behind us. We had a little wetland right behind us, but that was really too exposed. So Dylan, you ended up hauling in water for us most days. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Except a couple times when there was too much activity and you guys were worried about potential disturbances.
Yeah.
So you planned ahead, and I brought, I think he says sometimes we brought a little extra food, water. So yeah, it was good. I'm sure our trails are still out there.
I did pump on a couple occasions, I recall. I think it was in one of those spaces where, we did miss a day or something. And then also maybe the next stop, I think there was crane. The crane was, the female was out. And something you had to turn back. There was one part that was longer. There was at least 2 occasions I pumped, but we just had to pump enough to get by. But I actually thought the water tasted pretty good up there. It was, you can see the oil slick on top, as you do in boggy environments, right? Because it's not actually oil. It's an oil from the anoxic conditions in the soil. Where the plant material breaks down really slowly and accumulates all this really rich organic matter. Anyways, that's where the oil comes from, right? But I don't want to drink that, but I always think it's got like the earthiest taste when I pump stuff like that. I'm like, that's a nice cup of water. It's interesting, but it was hard because, you didn't want to be out of Mike literally never left his blind, but I popped out just that back door to either boil us some water for, a bag of food to heat up, or coffee, or to pump water. And it was, I didn't do that much because you took such good care of us, Army crawling in with like some hot meal and a bunch of water. But I did when I had to, and the coffee every day. I mean, Mike was like, Andy, you're a saint. I mean, it was about the biggest thank you. It's like, God, Andy, God bless you, or something. Every time Mike was so thankful for that cup of coffee. I'd do just barely through the door, and I'd get my little quiet stove. You had the jet boil, which is a lot louder than my little quiet.
Yeah, we never turned that on. Yeah.
The radios freaked me out, though. That was the one that worried me the most about scaring the cranes. When you're like, that little squelch. And at first they were pretty perky to it. And over time they were like, whatever, we're used to that sound, just like Dylan in the wilderness, right? He's like listening for everything. Is it dangerous? the fourth time you hear something and it doesn't kill you, you're like, okay, that's fine. But that radio squelch made me about the most nervous sound at first.
We were looking at the same thing, but we were looking at it in very different ways. You know, I have a notebook with me that is my notebook that I filled taking my own observations, but they weren't really observations. They were just, you know, journals and really bad sketches of things, and a lot of mosquito blood because it was, you know, great fly swatter. But we were looking at the nest, and I would write stuff about what I was seeing, and your notebook, you were looking at the nest, and you were doing something completely different. Yours didn't even have words in it. Or if it did, they were just on the margins. It were more symbols and numbers and such. So talk a little bit about the science without getting too sciencey, about the stretch of all of that.
You want me to grab my notebook? It's in here.
Yeah, go
Flash
ahead.
it in the page.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You do that, and I'll look for one of my pages, because this shows up in the book too. But yeah, like, so this is June 6th, June 7th. This is my really, really awesome sketch of a whooping crane, and it's got red blood splatter, which is the mosquitoes, because you could just, you know, it was pretty easy. But in my scribble, and there's Andy's. Hold yours up at the same time.
It doesn't even make sense.
This way. Yeah, a little further over.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
There it is. So you got some notes down the bottom, but you got a lot of numbers and symbols and that sort of thing. So what was it like as the scientist Andy, the science Andy had on? What the hell were you doing over there anyway?
So everything was a table, right? So each page is like a series of vertical columns where they each note a particular behavior. And every 3 minutes, I'd be like, what behavior am I seeing? And then, you know, through basically a simple equation, I estimated some distances on the landscape through triangulation. And essentially it was how far are the chicks from the parents, how far are the chicks from the nest, what is these behavioral rates like foraging or alert or defensive behavior, you know, and then what other stuff, you know, comes up, like, you know, their foraging rates and things. And so it just paired so well with Mike, as Mike's over there taking, you know, most people who do behavioral research, including myself and several other studies, you're looking through your scope. You think that you know what they're eating. You might get a crappy photo and you're getting, but you know what rate they were eating it at, you know, but to pair what I was doing with Mike would just add so much to the data, right? Like, I'm looking through my scope. I'm like, I think they're eating spiders. Well, that's not been recorded before. And Mike's like, hey, Andy, I got a perfect picture of a spider. You're like, oh my God, confirmation. Yes. You know, so being next to Mike is like a behavioral scientist's dream, essentially, because you're capturing what I think I'm seeing and trying to write down really quick. And that pairing is incredibly powerful.
Well, the fun thing is that we learned that we had, we both had iPhones. And so, you know, obviously we're not connected out there, Wi-Fi, but we could airdrop to each other. And so I would take a picture with this, you know, 50 megapixel camera that you could, you know, zoom into the nostril of the crane or into the tongue and see exactly what it is that they're eating. I'd take a picture of that with my phone on the back of the screen of my camera, and then I'd airdrop it to you, and then you would confirm it and write it down. And I just thought that was beautiful. It's like a lovely scientific tango there.
It was unbeatable. It was great. I mean, and like I said, the product came out of it that, you know, being the Crane Working Group, which is a place where crane scientists put their stuff. Everybody's like, wow, there's so much new stuff in here. It was really that combination of art and science that takes you to a new level sometimes. And also, Dylan, just so you know, there's a sentence about you being our intrepid guide who kept us from dying in there, just so you know.
So you did, was it roughly 90 hours of observation, something
right
like that, right?
Yep.
And I think I shot way too many photographs. You know, I don't know what the count was, you know, like 7,000 or something. And then I believe something like 5 hours of video. And our greatest hope was to try to document a hatch of chicks. That was really our goal. I mean, that's why we went when we went, you know. And as, a complete crapshoot, right? I mean, everything has to go right. Nothing can go wrong in order for that to happen. And the window of time that we chose in early June to go was based somewhat of some, fuzzy math on the back of a napkin and previous experience looking at these telemetry birds and knowing roughly when they show up. And, typically, if I can be really, really general here, whooping cranes primarily show up back into wood buffalo in early May, around that first week of May. And then it usually takes them about a week to establish a nest if they are breeders. And then once they establish a nest, they very quickly will lay eggs, and then those eggs hatch at roughly 30 days. And then those chicks will stay on that nest anywhere from 1 to 3 days, and then move with mom and dad off into the larger realm of their nesting territory and probably not come back to that nest again. So we were trying to time this all to make sure that we had the best chance of documenting that hatch. And we had gone through 6 days and we had nothing. We had a lot of watching birds exchanging at the nest, unison calling, a lot of cool behaviors, all this stuff. But those eggs were just sitting there. And we were beginning to worry that our time was going to run out because we had a 10-day window that we had agreed on with the park and with the helicopter pilot and with Dylan and his family and his role and us. And we had fire that was not close to us, but it was, I would like Dylan talk about that fire, but that was like in the background. And I know Dylan probably had a lot of conversation, was thinking a lot about that, sort of sheltering us from any of those conversations at the time. But I think you and I, Andy, both knew that, we could just tell. You could see the haze. You could smell the smoke where we were. So it was six days, and I don't know, Andy, do you remember the time that you saw the first pipping of the egg?
Well, yes, I can describe that. And then I have to give you and your daughter also some credit for pretty much guessing with your math the exact hatch date. So, we were 6 days in, but we were still a little ahead of what you predicted as that exact hatch date. And then we hit it and they hatched, right? And pretty incredible. But, I think I remember how excited you were. That's remembering. I was like, Mike, I think I see a hole in the side of that egg. I think it's pipping. And you're like, are you sure, Andy? And you were like, all of a sudden you switched gears, and I felt it and I heard it in your voice. Like, yeah, you switched gears. You went from like, this is cool, but I really want to see the hatch to like, oh, this might happen, and I remember that. I actually remember your reaction more than the cranes. I mean, because they're just turning their egg, they're doing their thing, they're switching nests, and all of a sudden, the egg rolled, and it was the bottom wider end kind of rolled toward me, and I saw this little dime-sized hole and a little bill poke, which looks like a pinky going through a hole. And I was like, Mike, I think there's a hole, and then we're off to the races. And the next several days, I was hoping, and you knew it, but you two were more thinking about the fire. I was wrapped once that happened in terms of behavioral stuff, because that's what's really never been, documented as the parental care, especially the differential parental care of the older and younger chick, because they have asynchronous hatching, which is pretty weird. Most birds, like a lot of birds, like they hatch pretty close at the same time. But a lot of raptors, a lot of cranes, birds that don't have a lot of eggs, they'll have this asynchronous thing going on, So how do they really care for those little colts, And, the fire was, we knew we didn't have a window, and had we not exited when we did, we could have, it could have been really problematic. We probably got our last day out before the evac, right? But I was like, I remember right at the end, Mike, I was like, oh, maybe 2 more hours, and it was just an amazing time once it started. So it was those first 6 days were pretty slow. And then as soon as that hit, it was something novel all the time.
Yeah.
Until the minute we left,
Yeah. Yeah, I remember. So you remember maybe the excitement in my voice more than anything with the pipping of the egg. I couldn't wait to tell Dylan, because I knew meanwhile Dylan's sitting back there and it's six days in, and Dylan's Dylan, but you were getting a little down too. I think you were having some things that were weighing a little bit more on your mind that I'm sure had to do a lot with how in the heck am I going to get these guys out? And I'm going to have to pull them, all of that. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, Dylan, tell us something we don't know.
You almost had to walk 14 kilometers down Nireling River to the highway with all your crap on your back. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah, that was your escape route, about 14.3 kilometers straight down the side of that river, where the year before a guy got attacked by a bear and we had to actually shoot that bear there. But so you knew the area pretty well. But we were running out of opportunity to get the fire choppers as they were being dispatched around to fight fire in certain areas. We became somewhat of a liability for the crews there, and didn't want to stress you guys out and have anybody know about how close the doomsday clock was to ticking. And as you guys got more excited, the clock just continuously ticked, and it was like, oh my God, these guys need to get this picture or whatever it is they're doing before this chopper shows up. And then I was talking to people back at parks who were telling me to pull you guys and everything was. And then talking to Chuck and them from fire, saying that we needed to get out of there, not just for our safety, but for the safety of the people that could come and get us. And
yeah, right.
I can tell you one thing here and that is that we would have hiked the 14 miles, but it wouldn't have been with all our stuff. It would have been, hey, Mark, we're leaving all our stuff in the blind, because they did take our blinds down, which was the best move ever. That we moved out with the birds still on the platform, which we didn't really want to do, but we knew we had that time crunch. And it created such a great backdrop that we would have packed it up tidy for Mark and made sure to take the food and the water out. But I think we would have had to survival pack that out, be as light as possible, or we would have sunk in the mud.
Thankfully, nothing bad at all happened.
Well, I'll circle back then to we had a pipping egg at day 6, and then that first chick hatched. And it was crazy just watching that little one find its legs. At the same time, it was quite something to watch the parents become parents again. I think Andy and I decided that the mom had probably done this before, but the dad was sort of dorky in a way. We didn't know maybe if it's been a year and he hadn't done this and is trying to remember, or maybe he was a younger bird,
That was fun. But this was just real funny because the male ended up feeding more on this pair, right? But maybe about 60% of the time, but was much worse at it. So told a dragonfly that was too big, too far away from the chick, and the chick would be stabbing at it and falling over. When the female brought food, it was a smaller dragonfly right up to its face, and it would just chomp it away, And it was just like the male would keep bringing up this, the chick eventually was like, I'm just going to bite this dragonfly in half, and the refuse would drop to the ground, But it was kind of funny.
It was really fascinating. It's really difficult to, talk about it through a podcast. It'd be a lot more fun to show it to you, but that was really remarkable to see, and that little chick finding its way in the world. And then we were watching the other egg because we hadn't, as Dylan said, the clock was ticking faster and faster. We were really concerned about disturbance on the way out. We didn't want to disrupt anything. And we saw finally the pip of the second egg. And that chick ended up hatching, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, but I think about 40 hours after the first chick, which is pushing it. So, and that was the day that we knew we needed to pull out. And it was hard to leave in a lot of ways. And the first time I really saw those birds in person in 3D was when we packed up to leave, and when I pulled that camera out of the portal, because I'd been looking at them on the back of a screen the whole time, and it was, I don't know, choked me up a little bit when we left, but I'm glad that we left when we did. And both of those chicks, we know based on the remote cameras that were nearby at that nest, did end up getting provisioned. We don't know how that little second chick probably didn't make it, my guess, but you never know. And then we slogged out. Took us about an hour to slog out. It's the first time that either of us had stood up in 8 days, which was pretty interesting experience with everything else that we could carry on our back, following Dylan back to camp. And then, as Dylan said, they're trying to thread the needle to get all of us out of there. And Paul Springer, helicopter pilot, said that when he flew up from Fort McMurray the next morning to get us, he was flying at tree level most of the way. So I skipped over a bunch of stuff, but I think we could talk forever about this and really dig into a lot of the more intimate moments in there. But let me ask both of you, take the opportunity to talk about what did you learn in this experience personally, and what did you take away from that? And what do these birds mean to you today?
For me, whooping cranes, this was, it's like going in somebody's house, right? I've been on the road with them in the Central Flyaway. I've seen where they vacation down on the Texas coast, but I hadn't been into their bedroom. I hadn't gotten all the way into the house. And this was, the most intimate experience. And so to get to see them everywhere throughout that life cycle, it adds a completeness, and, to me, there's this quote about the Platte River that a few conservationists have said, and I don't know who to attribute it to officially, but it is, did the Platte River save the whooping crane, or did the whooping crane save the Platte River? And when you look at the whole Central Flyway, that whole place the whooping crane uses, there's only a few endangered species that tie the landscape together like the whooping cranes. And for me, they're not only this thing that's important in of themselves, but they're sort of this, if you describe them as an angel or a harbinger of something bigger, they represent kind of all wildlife in that Central Flyway, Great Plains corridor from the boreal down to the coastal plain. And, for me, it's almost like they're pointing a path, right? From here all the way down, this is what you do. You get this right for me, we'll cover it. We'll cover those shorebirds, and everything else. And so, it was sort of the last piece in that puzzle for me, because I've seen the rest of that puzzle. And the biggest thing I learned was, wow, it's actually the northwest extent of all these bird species we heard up there of their breeding range, just like the whooping cranes, right? Whether it's the common yellowthroat or the Wilson snipe or the American bittern, a lot of these birds were up, on the northwest part of their range as well. And it's sort of like, this is where that province really ends, this kind of open province of parklands and wetlands. And so for me, it was a complete story. It was a completion of something, seeing all their doors and windows open, and that story about everything they represent and, and their conservation represents. So for me, that's a little heady and a little floaty, but it's sort of the truth. It was like a closed loop.
Thanks, Andy. Dylan.
That's going to be tough to follow, Andy. God darn. Okay. Yeah. I will add some context to why it might be hard to follow. You guys live these birds. This is your life. This is it. You've made it bed and you're sleeping in it quite comfortably, it seems to me. Yeah, for me it's a little more separate, but to go to what the cranes now represent to me, I suppose, or what they meant in the end, is I was blown away by the way that they could connect us from so far away. Like, we have no business ever meeting, and then this bird who's lived with 1 million+ years unchanged, I believe he said, and has just gone through all of these things and all of the different versions, not just of us, our modern day people, but everything, every single version. It blows me away the thought of how many different connections and how many different species and how many different things have been affected by these birds is just sort of a mind-blowing concept to me, that strangers could meet up over this one goal of just the mystery of this bird, and then meeting the bird and finding it's this strange sentience in it, as if it knew something, and then it was just okay with it, and it could tell you to piss off or go away. It could do whatever it wants. It could disappear back into the seeming mystic in the blink of an eye. And it's almost not like we were so good at what we were doing. It's that it let us keep doing it as it picked up on something. There's got to be more to its emotions or feelings or what it could see than what our eyes look at. So somehow it decided we were safe to be there. It allowed us into, I guess, as you termed, its bedroom or its house, but it showed us something, and it had to have been for some reason. It has to be so you guys continue to share this and continue to keep those connections. Perhaps the birds aren't the main focus of all of this, or maybe it's people's drive to conserve and proof of willingness to do the right thing. Keep something special alive, because it sort of is our unicorn now. It's something to definitely to be proud of, that exists, and that's true conservationism. That's true just a love of a species and the hopes that you can keep it, much longer than you'll still be here, knowing full well that you're just a dot, like a piece of sand in its history, or just one star in its sky. And it was the ability of the bird to connect people and places and things and history and moments and thoughts of uranium and wolf tracks and bugs and bears and swamps and your life straw, and just brought together with this thing, the gear we had just to get there, like this technology and everything just to survive in the place that it wanders around. It was pretty mind-blowing. I never go after animals, like I mentioned at the beginning, that don't it's not serve a utility purpose, but perhaps it's more of that, where these guys are it's just the pure wonder of these guys. There is nothing you get from them except maybe answering a few more little pieces of that wonderment along the way. And it was odd. It's like their eyes almost judge you. They almost see through you. They've almost seen every possible version of what people could ever be or do to this earth in their flight plan that showed, the best. Through looking down, they've seen the golden ages and, every downside, every depression. They've seen Great Plains where you're from be rid of animals and reintroduce new ones, and farm fields and trees. And it's just insane to think of what they see, and then to be there at that time all together in that place to witness it. It's wild. As far as the science as to why, I don't know, man. I didn't get any more science than I went with, that's for sure. But certainly a sense of amazement in a story I'll never forget. And it's just like in that greater appreciation they gave to themselves through allowing us in there. I guess it expands the appreciation for all the other animals around and that have sort of done that same thing. Not to personify them, but there is something about them that is, they have their own personality, they have their own drives, they have their own little dimorphic traits, and the differences, and it's neat. Yeah, I feel like you could go on forever, but just to prove that it's interesting to find out that there's something you don't know. And those birds definitely prove that there's many things we don't know. Yeah. Neat.
Damn, Dylan. Well, I don't think there's anything else to say. I'm really, I feel really, really blessed that we were able to do this together, and that they have connected us in this way. These are connections we'll have the rest of our lives, and they've been doing that for a very long time. And maybe that's the most important thing of all. One thing, Dylan, I got to ask you.
Yep.
Man, and Andy, you're going to have to help me with this. We need to get Dylan down south. And I'm not talking, down south into Saskatchewan, Dylan. I'm talking down south to the Texas Gulf Coast, to the Platte River, and connect you down in those geographies with those birds. So if we're able to figure out a way to do that, would you consider it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Bring your family too.
Yeah, mind you, none of us have ever been across that border or nothing like that before.
Yeah. Well, if it's on my deathbed, I'm going to make that happen. You know, hopefully making it happen in my deathbed or not
tied
together in the next couple of years. But yeah, so we're gonna do that. And because you both are musicians, because Dylan, you AKA Crook the Kid, and your music, Andy and his music. Andy just put something up. You're now out on Apple, right?
I've got
Apple
a couple
music,
songs on
Andy.
there.
Oh, go.
That was the first thing that Andy did when we got out of the bush, Dylan, was go grab a guitar and start playing. And we're finding that there are many other musicians up and down the flyway too that are inspired about place and inspired by these birds. And man, I'd love to have a music festival around these birds and tie people together that way. So that's another thing I'm throwing out there to the listeners, because that just doesn't happen on its own, but I think we can make it happen. So anyway, any last thoughts, boys, before we wrap up?
If you use Soundtrap, Dylan, we could collab, man. I could see a super good, like, angry whooping crane, like hip hop rap, with a little bit of a, kind of a jive background.
Yeah.
Just let me know. You're probably like, dude, I'm an Americana folky kind of guy. So, I might, but I could try to set something up,
Yeah.
But if
rap is just what I do to people, but I actually do folk music, and acoustic is the only thing I do at home.
Really?
Yeah. Rap for me isn't the music thing. I have no interest whatsoever in the outcome of rap music. That was just the one that you could do when you had nothing but a pencil, right? And that's the one that made the most sense. You could always get a beat off of, I guess in the start, how rappers used to release albums and then they'd have instrumental tracks right at the end. So it was a very Wu-Tang thing to do. So it just became a love of poetry turned into that. And rap is by no means the type of music I only do. And yeah, it's just the one that connected to where I'm from, and the one that we had the ability to do, because no one had instruments and stuff such as that. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to start I like to write. I was already kind of writing, like, I'm a crane and I'm mad flying over. Like, I have a hip hop idea. Like, I'm really mad you took my wetland, and I was working it in my head, but we can start from a more positive place, too. But,
yeah, well, perhaps you'd do it from you looking at the crane, not from the crane looking at you.
That's a good songwriter. I might already have that one.
I don't want to wrap up, but I got to. And I know you all have got your lives here. So thanks again, Dylan and Andy, for being a part of this, and for sharing your experiences and your connections and your hearts. So I love you both. In this podcast series, I will have conversations with the scientists, artists, landowners, and others that I have met along my journey, who all have a shared connection with their love for whooping cranes. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining.